Thanks everyone for joining us today, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. We'll give everyone just a minute more to join, and then we'll get started. While we wait, we'll remind you that there will be a question and answer session following the discussion with Tom Mainelli, and we'll ask you to submit your questions in the questions box as shown here. We'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A. For any questions that we don't get to, we'll get back to you in email within 24 hours of this webinar. I also want to recognize that one of our neighbors here in Silicon Valley, a well-known hardware company from Cupertino, is making announcements today, and we appreciate you taking the time here with us, even though that's going on. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our new AR Insights webinar series. And our first guest is Tom Mainelli, the Group Vice President at International Data Corporation, IDC. And Tom, welcome. It's great to have you here. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you focus on at IDC.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. I manage a team at IDC that looks at a wide range of devices. Everything from smartphones and tablets to PCs, smart home, wearables, etc. But I myself have been very focused on the AR, VR market for about 4 years. So very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. And with me today as well is my colleague Nag, who's a veteran in enterprise SaaS space. And I'm the Director of Marketing here at Athere, and I was also a journalist for a long time. And in fact, I think Tom and I have a few people that we know in common from the days in which I wore that hat. Nag, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Great to have this opportunity to talk about our pet space, which is augmented reality. I've generally been in the enterprise SaaS space for the last couple of decades as a product manager, as a technical architect, and as a solution consultant. I joined Athere as the chief product officer through an acquisition. I co-founded a company called Flight, which was mainly centered around creating excellent customer experiences with more intelligent targeting of content and resources. And very excited to be part of this journey with Athere into this space, and looking forward to working with our customers to create innovative solutions to improve their efficiencies.
Thanks, Nag. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to first of all talk about the world of work and how that's changed, particularly in the last 7 or 8 months, basically since the calendar flipped to 2020. Then we're going to talk about how frontline teams in particular have been impacted by a lot of these changes, and how that's created a bunch of new challenges, and you know, how they can be met and what kind of new approaches are needed in order to do that. And then what strategies can we provide using technology to empower them. And then also talk a little bit about the complexity of that challenge, because it isn't easy. You know, no two frontline teams are the same, but a lot of the use cases are common. And then we're going to talk about some of those use cases, including remote collaboration, remote self-assistance, knowledge capture and transfer, and then a bit about learning in the flow of work, particularly the concept of guidance versus training. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about how things have changed. I think everyone is aware of the major changes we've all been dealing with. I mean, you can see in this picture here something you wouldn't have seen a year ago in an industrial setting. You wouldn't necessarily be wearing the gloves and the mask, but today you are. Also in behind that would be some social distancing and some work distancing and a number of other challenges that the companies are facing. If in fact their operations are up and running at a particular moment. So Tom, I'm going to turn to you first in terms of your general thoughts about how you've seen your customers and enterprises in general, what they're telling you about how things have changed for them and what they've got to deal with.
Yeah, it's a great question because I think sort of inherent in the comments you made is you've got frontline workers who have to go someplace to work, right? Versus a huge percentage of employees that have been sent home to work, and trying to figure out what the balance is between folks that need to be on a factory floor, servicing machinery, et cetera, and the rest of the workforce that's now dealing with shared broadband, VPNs, all kinds of stuff that they hadn't really considered, IT hadn't considered, all kinds of challenges around sending the workforce home from HQ. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is as the pandemic took hold, a lot of organizations went into triage mode, right? Just trying to figure out how do we get from point A to point B. There is still some of that going on. We'll have to be honest, from region to region. Different regions have handled COVID and the spread in different ways. But some companies are beginning to think, okay, what is this going to look like when we get past this? And how have things changed permanently? How are we going to help frontline workers who may not have the same access to people who were once back at HQ, et cetera. So lots of sort of triaging right now, lots of people trying new technologies like augmented reality to see if it's something that can help them in the short term. And then a lot of companies beginning to think, all right, if this helps us in the short term, how does it help us in the long term for what the next normal is going to look like?
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And Nag, I know that you're also on the front line of talking to our customers and helping them through these challenges. In general, what kinds of things are you hearing?
Yeah, very similar to what Tom mentioned. Basically, there's obviously a greatly increased awareness of remote collaboration tools, including augmented reality applications, that than ever before. So, as Tom mentioned, basically, most of the companies are having to keep a skeleton crew on site and then be supported by a larger team elsewhere or remotely, right? So that automatically means that they have to work with them differently. They can't just use a radio and call out and ask for help. They need to use it through other applications and tools. So that means that in some ways, they have to be efficient at this type of a remote collaboration. And be it, in the process of, doing a particular job or a work, or trying to show them something, right? So that means that the efficiencies have to be gained in that regard. And the other natural fallout from that is that's for the frontline workers themselves, but then their managers or supervisors are now saying, okay, great. So we're seeing that somebody's gone into a site, got the work done. So let's talk a little bit more about the visibility of the work. What exactly happened? What steps did they do? Right? So basically an awareness of trying to understand where the bottlenecks are, how to make that better. Is there a trail, an audit of what the user did on site? And can I see a dashboard of that? So those are also getting, increasing demand and requests from our customers.
Thanks, Doug. And that's actually a fantastic segue into some research that we've seen from IDC and about how enterprises, and particularly frontline teams, are being impacted. And Tom, maybe you can talk to this data. I know it's from this environmental health and safety study that IDC released in June, but I thought it was really interesting in terms of how enterprises are looking at the impacts and the kinds of things that are important. As Nag referred to, we're seeing improving operational and production efficiency right at the top of that list. So maybe you can kind of walk us through this a bit.
Yeah, it's so it's a super interesting point, right? EH&S has typically, been focused on cost savings and health and safety, et cetera. But what they've, been forced to reckon with, and Nag talked a little bit about it, as they've had to, separate their workforces, is how do we make people more efficient? How do we drive efficiency using both the back end infrastructure that we already have, and utilizing new software and new tools. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is that, while a lot of this is happening ad hoc right now, what we will begin to see over time is that efficiency driven by data, right? Not just best practices, but okay, we're now looking at how, let's say, 3 different factories do something, and we've established what we think are the best practices in those places. But with, when you're capturing this and you're looking at best practices and monitoring those things, things start to bubble up, right? And a lot of this is going to be sort of done manually in the early days, but over time, as platforms evolve and AI gets involved, we're going to be able to bubble this stuff up and drive greater efficiencies just by using these tools.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Tom. And Naga, I'm wondering how you see the path forward as we have greater and greater need for the kind of data that Tom's talking about, and the use of it that you referred to earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it's very gratifying to see that, the list of priorities from the survey here is very much mirroring the customers' interest in the customers and the prospects that we talk to. So it's almost exactly the same ones, and especially, the ones to improve the efficiency strikes a particular note. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, is that in some way the company, or essentially the leaders of the company, have a few, all these frontline workers at different job sites, and they kind of want to have like a running view or a dashboard and a complete end-to-end view of basically the full work execution. Right. So basically, earlier you could piece that together from different places, but now they want it in a more digitized format. And the other thing that I think we'll see a shift towards is there's been a lot of emphasis in the tools available today that say, where to go. So a lot of emphasis was placed on the scheduling. For example, a worker has to go to this job site 1 to job site 2, and there are scheduling software that says where to go, what job to do, right? But now the next aspect of it, which is that what exactly happened at the job site, it was some of it was a black box. Did it take 2 hours? What were the steps that were done? Was there any materials that were needed that were not available? So needing that data and throwing some light on it, and collecting of the data becomes very critical, because that's one way that you can improve the operational efficiencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also speaks to the point earlier about actually all of this being part of a broader plan, or needing to be part of a broader plan. And Tom, I know we talked about this a few days ago, that IDC has developed this model for 5 stages of enterprise recovery, and that wearables and mobile applications and sensors and integrated collaboration are all kind of part of that story. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the larger strategy, because we've done a lot of thinking about this as well. In fact, last year we even produced a thing we call a maturity model that looked at what we saw as the 4 stages the companies would go through as they mature in their use of augmented reality, AI, machine learning, and all of the supporting technologies to realize the kind of vision we're talking about.
Yeah, this has been a big effort at IDC to try to understand, and I used the term earlier, triaging, right? Where organizations are just trying to keep the business running. And that's really the first stage, right? This business continuity stage, where they are looking at new technologies like wearables, looking at sensors to keep track of employees' health, et cetera. It has, I think, in a lot of ways accelerated, organizations' willingness to look at these technologies. Like, a lot of companies probably had these on their to-do lists, but COVID, forced them to take a close look at it, maybe move some spending around to make these things happen. So to your point, on the left of this, we're looking at wearables and temperature tracking and PPE and all these things that are really needed to drive some business continuity. As we go into this economic slowdown, and I'm on calls day in and day out where people are trying to figure out, when are things going to slow down. We're seeing, strength in different parts of the technology stack, but ultimately we will head into this recession, right? And how do you plan for that? And then how do you try to accelerate up the curve on the other side by taking the technologies that you're leveraging today, thinking about what the next step for those technologies are. And as you see, you get out to the right on this, you're thinking about hybrid work policies, integrated collaboration tools, really taking everything from point A where we are today to points B and C and building it into the future enterprise as opposed to this sort of ad hoc, we need what we need right now.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And Nag, I know that this kind of also fits quite well with the roadmap that you've put together in terms of development. A number of the elements that are called out here are part of things that you've been working on. Everything from offering the device on wearables and being mobile, to offering integrated collaboration, collaborative workspaces, et cetera. So how do you see this kind of a model?
I think that the key point here is basically the approach or solution should encompass many things. It's part of a larger strategy, as the slide says. I think that customers may tend to have these solutions today, but more of a piecemeal approach because there would have been individual departments asking for a collaboration tool versus something around wearables. And now there needs to be some thought put together to say, what can we do in a more holistic manner, right? So basically bringing a single experience becomes very important because you now have to have that person who is the frontline technician or the worker trying to get their work done in a safer, better, faster way. And so how do you make sure that they get all the data they need, they get the information, they get the next steps, the manuals at their fingertips to get the work done, rather than having to access multiple systems to do the work. And so a lot of what Tom mentioned earlier are definitely aspects of our product strategy to be able to say, how do they all fit in? And not only how they fit in is that what is the most relevant of that information in every screen or every experience that the user has as they perform the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we call out wearables and mobile devices, I know that you've also had done a lot of thinking about particularly serving frontline teams and the form factors and the technologies that are best applied to that. So Nag, maybe we could kind of start with you on this one and just talk a little bit about what form factors are best to fit what kind of situations.
Yeah, I think that's the key word that you mentioned in there, is that basically the function and the use case essentially determines or dictates the form factor that people use, right? I don't think there's one particular magic formula here, but roughly speaking, amongst most of the users of this kind of technologies, basically the roles tend to be someone who essentially administers or manages the system and creates or authors the work procedures. For a lot of those people, they tend to be basically sitting in front of a desktop or a portal, makes it logically convenient, and you have the tools to be able to create or author these procedures quickly, right? And then you have a lot of subject matter experts. Now, these are people who might be experienced workers or peers of the frontline workers, and they're ready to help out when there is a problem or a challenge. And so these subject matter experts could be on the go because they might be servicing more than one set of teams. And so they might be either on a laptop or could be on a mobile device, a smartphone, or a tablet. And then there are the technicians themselves, and they would need to basically be using either a company issued tablet or a smartphone, or in cases where they need to do a hands-free work, one of the wearables, whether it's a monocular or a binocular device, right? So I think the role and the function, the use case determines it. But I'll tell you something else that may be somewhat controversial is the reality is a lot of the workers these days, the world doesn't always fit into one, meaning that you might start your job on your tablet, access the job, go through a couple of steps, you might get stuck. And then in that case, you might want to exchange some information with somebody else. And then you have to show them what is the problem. So at that time, you might say, okay, let me put on a wearable, and then I'll show you what I'm seeing. And then after I'm done with that, I might want to get back to filling out some checklists back on my tablet, right? So the reality is that we need to be able to provide a platform that works seamlessly and similarly across various form factors.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that's incredibly important. And I think, early on in this space, all of us probably over-indexed on the headsets, right? They were gee whiz, they drive, really interesting experiences. But there's going to be some percentage of employees for which a headset is always overkill. There's going to be some percentage that absolutely have to have a headset because they need to use both hands. And I think, it's important for organizations that are going down this path to recognize that up front and maybe not get too hung up on, how are we going to purchase and deploy tens, hundreds of thousands of headsets when it may be a smaller number of headsets that they really need to begin this journey.
Yeah, and I think that actually dovetails neatly into the next discussion, which is about how complex the needs of the frontline teams are. I mean, just as the function is going to dictate which form factor is going to be needed. You can't have an easy predictor of what challenges a frontline team is going to want to face. So at the moment in the market, you see a lot of point solutions, a lot of people who are doing digital workflows, or they're doing AR video assistance, or they're doing learning and training, or they've got some sort of a chat application. And it seems to me that the time of the point solution, particularly, just a plain, simple, see what I see video, is probably waning. I'm kind of wanting to think about where all this goes long term. So maybe I will start with you, Tom, on that, and then Nog, you can kind of talk a bit about the work that we've done and the thinking we've done about how to tackle this.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think, near term, some of those see what I see businesses are doing great because there's so much demand and there's so much interest in, how can I get through what we're going through right now? But I fundamentally agree with the idea that just as that chart sort of showed, us going from dealing with the crisis to a more evolved enterprise. Enterprises want less complexity, not more. They want back-end systems to work with new applications. They want to be able to move inside a platform to articulate or access new information, new experts, data, et cetera. So I think long term, I absolutely agree that platforms are evolving that are going to make this both less complex for IT to deploy and manage, but more specifically, less complex for the end user to get to where they need to go in terms of data, expertise, et cetera.
Totally agree with you, Tom. I think that in some ways, having worked with a number of our customers in these areas and what they're looking to do, one of our key, kind of a value props of creating a unified kind of a single framework or a platform for frontline teams was precisely that. That was kind of a keystone of our our product architecture was that we envisioned that people would need to do some of these aspects at some point of time during their work. Maybe not all at once, maybe not all at the same time. But to the point that you made, basically, if you can imagine a proverbial technician trying to do a machine inspection, right? Maybe on a shop floor. And then, today they have to take a paper printout of the work order, walk up to the machine, and then start trying to, perform the procedure or an inspection. And for that, they would need, if they don't know what they're doing, they need some help. They need some overlays and step-by-step instructions. So you might need a solution for that. Now, if it so happens that you got stuck somewhere in there and you needed some additional assistance, you might want to call a peer or or an expert or a support team and say, how can help me out, right? And then so you might have to use a different application to connect with them, or to chat with them or exchange some files. And then you might, last but not the least, to show them the actual problem and get help in real time. So then you might want to use a video assistant solution. So you might end up carrying 3 or 4 devices to accomplish the same work. And we think that there's value in bringing them all together into one simplified experience where you understand more about what the user is trying to do, and create a very simple but an elegant experience to say, you can seamlessly go from one of these use cases to another without switching an application or a context. And the reality is, and customers will be free to decide when they want to pick that up. They may not all do it at the same time, but when they're ready to do so, it needs to logically fit in to the previous features that they are looking to work with.
That's great insight, Nag. And I'm wondering, Tom, if that's the kind of thing that you're hearing from enterprises as they're trying to navigate all of the different offerings that are available to them at a time where they have urgent needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it obviously depends on the enterprise. Different enterprises have different levels of expertise in the areas that we're talking about. Some need more help than others, and some need more guidance than others. But I think if we broadly, this is where the market is moving, right? Any tech market starts the way this one did, and as more large enterprises get serious about this, as they begin to recognize, the clear ROI here. They are thinking about the ways that they can go from piecemeal sort of cobbling together multiple different experiences and different offerings towards something that's more cohesive.
All right, so I also wanted to just touch on something that I think is a fun and kind of illustrative way of thinking about the first of the big use cases around remote support. And talking about being old, I'm also old enough to remember the Apollo 13 mission, where astronauts on Apollo 13, they had this urgent, drastic issue where they had to find some way of dealing with the growing amount of carbon dioxide in the lunar lander that they had to use as their lifeboat. But they didn't have instructions on how to build something to fix that problem. And so the mission control figured out a solution. You can see that on the left. They built it, and then they conveyed work instructions to the astronauts. And what you see on the right is what they actually built. And Tom, I'm wondering how this strikes you as a good example of the power of remote support and work instructions.
Yeah, it is. It's a great story, and I think it just it shows us that we were always on this path, right? That the most advanced scientists in the world were dabbling with this out of need, right? Like when push comes to shove, you use the technology that you have in front of you to get the job done. And I think that, the rest of the world is now catching up. And I think, broadly speaking, I think enterprises, have had a crash course in not just remote support, but, remote work, remote collaboration. I mean, all of this has just been accelerated by what we're living through right now. And again, necessity, right? Utilize the technology that we have in new ways to get the job done.
Yep. Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree, and I think that we've seen that particularly in industrial settings where we've seen customers who've had a plan that maybe they were going to kind of do some proof of concepts and some trials in the first quarter of this year, and then gradually kind of roll things out throughout the rest of the year to saying, no, we actually need to do the entire year's plan now. Because we can see that it works, and we don't want to, dilly-dally, because that could prevent us from meeting the kinds of challenges that we've got in front of us. It kind of, I started looking at some of the research that IDC had done around all of this, Tom, and one of the things that came up to me was this survey, which talked about prior to COVID, that there was something of an underinvestment in remote work technologies and how that's kind of shifted. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what you've seen.
Yeah, I think to the point I made earlier, necessity has driven organizations to think much harder about this. One of you said this early on, right? Whether it's in a manufacturing or service-oriented organization, you can no longer just pick up a walkie or call somebody at their desk. And when you create, or when you leave friction in the system like that, it just causes all sorts of ramifications. And I think one of the things that we've seen as this technology has begun to resonate with people is that, and with enterprises, is that you can see how it cuts back on friction, makes processes go more smoothly, can drive faster iteration, increase safety. Like, there's all these sort of knock-on effects to making it easier for people in the process to communicate. And so I think that our surveys are beginning to reflect that, because IT decision makers are beginning to understand that better.
Right, and I guess they also understand some of these use cases. So if we talk about a use case like remote collaboration, they can see the power of that being mobile. The people that they want to connect with, I think we started out if you like, the modeling of this scenario with somebody in the field talking to an expert. But what we've seen since then is actually, in a lot of cases, colleagues are going to be the first port of call. And not only that, but there may be also cases where, well, actually we need to talk to suppliers. Or in fact, maybe we need to talk to customers. You think about situations over the last few months where somebody gets a piece of equipment that somebody else was going to come to their house and install. Maybe they don't want to come to their house right now.
Right.
And so you need to have some ways of enabling that, and wondering how you've seen that change.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really interesting as I talk with both enterprises and software vendors and the end users is that remote collaboration is being used to enable remote collaboration. That, to your point exactly, right? Once upon a time, we'd send somebody out and they'd get you set up and sort of walk you through this new piece of equipment, et cetera. That's not possible right now. If you're in another country, it's literally not possible. And so I think we have seen that accelerate. And I think when this is over, there will be a return. There is still a value to having someone on site for some things, for sales, for training, et cetera. But I think a lot of it is going to stay this way because it's proven to be efficient, effective, and it costs less.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, how are you seeing that in your discussions with customers?
Yeah, exactly. I think Tom covered a lot of those points. I think we're seeing amongst our customers the need to connect or collaborate with your extended enterprise, right? So not just folks within your company. Obviously, your peers or experts is fine, but then could be the suppliers of the particular machine itself, as an example, right? They might be the experts on that, but they're not part of your company. And the other thing to keep in mind is what that, from a purely product point of view, what that's leading us to think about is to say, one, we need to make it very easy and frictionless to get external users to come into the system. I think Tom had it in the previous survey, where it's basically the ability to get people outside of your company to come in quickly, quote unquote, and guest access becomes really important, right? And many of these users may simply have their handheld devices or tablets. So ability to support a variety of them quickly becomes very important. Ability to get into such sessions without much friction is important. And then while you're within it, the ability for them to essentially, zoom in or turn on a flashlight or look at what's happening without having to, essentially trouble the user becomes important as well. Because you don't want 5 different people giving that person instructions to figure out what to do, right? So how to orchestrate those things is also equally important. And I always keep joking about this, saying that these kind of video sessions are more for the purpose of troubleshooting, right? They're not like a meeting where everybody is democratic and we speak at the same time. They're meant to solve a problem. So our experiences have to evolve around that. And that's what we are hearing from our customers. So.
That's really helpful. And I think it also kind of brings us to the discussion about the next use case, which is around remote self-assistance. So it's one thing to be creating a video session with someone and or groups of people, but it's another to be in a situation where, okay, I just need to help myself and get to the information that I need. This is requiring a number of things in terms of processes need to be digitized. You want to be able to create a record of work on a mobile device. And you also want to, as you said earlier, now be able to eliminate some paper-based systems. So Tom, I'm wondering what kind of demand you've seen for around or interest in remote self-assistance.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the areas where there's a fair amount of interest. It's also an area, to be candid, in a lot of these verticals you mentioned on here, no need for paper-based systems, right? A lot of these organizations are still running on paper-based systems, right? And so they know that this is where they need to get to. A lot of these workers didn't typically have access to a PC, a tablet, or a phone maybe. But by digitizing those assets, making those available to them, again, creating a much less friction in the system to get the job done. And so I think it is one of the steps that a lot of organizations are taking a look at. Maybe something a little more long-term than the immediate needs around getting an expert on the phone, et cetera. But it's a long-term investment a lot of organizations are making. And I think one of the important things to note is a lot of these organizations have the digital assets, right? They're just sitting on a hard drive somewhere. So how do they leverage the fact that they've got 20 or 30 years of CAD drawings and all kinds of useful information that's trapped on a hard drive or sitting on a shelf in a paper manual somewhere?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know, Nog, that you've been working with customers around helping to eliminate the need for paper-based systems using remote self-assistance. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the approach that you and the team have taken.
Yeah, I think I would say there are two key points, right? I think one of them is, and Tom referred to this, is basically there's already a lot of assets that are sitting within a company's network, right? Or availability. It could be a repository of manuals, information, data sheets, videos, right? How do you basically make them available at the point of need, right? There's no point if they're just sitting somewhere that you can only access after you go back to your desktop, right? So a large part of what we try to help our customers is to see if we can bring them together into a place where it can be accessed quickly. The other other area is that there are a lot of systems that, again, say there's a ticketing system or there's some kind of a work order system that's usually tells the technicians and the supervisors what needs to be done on a day-to-day basis, right? So how do you make sure you take that information and quickly translate it into the self-assistance options that are available with AR platforms without having to use pen and paper, right? So in other words, get the work order automatically into the system and then use the instructions and the manuals that are authored to basically help the user perform step-by-step instructions, right? So the key part for us when we think about the approach is the context. We place a lot of premium on the context, basically who, when, what, where, right? So meaning that for a particular user, their role, their division, their department, and the current job that they're on determines what content they should be seeing, what procedures they're allowed to execute on, and then basically who can they collaborate with. Right? So if you can narrow that down using the context, it makes their life a lot easier. So the next set of actions that they need to do become easier. So you essentially cut through a lot of that noise and present it in a simple view. So that's what we are looking to take in terms of an approach to helping customers with remote self-assistance.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails nicely with the opportunities for knowledge capture and transfer. Tom, you did a blog in June where you talked a bit about that, and that it being a kind of a key area for potential growth, and to meet the long-term challenge of the fact that a lot of companies' most valuable employees are going to be retiring within the next decade or so, and you need to capture that. So maybe we can kind of start the discussion keying off of your comments, Tom, and then Nog can talk a little bit about how that represents itself in terms of development.
Yeah, I really do think that this is one of the more interesting and exciting parts of this technology. As you mentioned, a lot of vertical industries are dealing with the fact that their most knowledgeable employees are, moving down the track towards retirement, and there's often a fair amount of knowledge that is contained inside their heads and nowhere else. I think the flip side to that too, that is exciting, is that we know that people that are entering the workforce want to learn in new ways, and that different people learn differently. And so, traditional class-based lecturing, manuals, etc., when you can capture knowledge from an expert inside of an augmented reality platform and then transfer that onto to new employees, they tend to learn faster, they tend to learn better. That means you can ramp them towards productivity much more quickly. And so I think this happens to be one of those areas that is addressing two challenges, right? The fact that you've got people that are aging out and that you need to ramp other people up quickly. And those folks are not necessarily interested in sitting in a classroom in front of a binder.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Nog, do you want to talk a little bit about how these challenges and opportunities have informed our approach?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Tom kind of covered the salient points there, is that clearly the generational aspect of it drives a lot of the knowledge capture and transfer needs. So, within our product as with others, we place a lot of premium on trying to figure out how to get these subject matter experts to, get their knowledge in a structured way that can be used to guide workers just coming on to the job to be able to perform it in a more efficient manner, right? So the tools are out there to make it happen, but in some ways, I'll take it a little, further. Is in some ways the real value here is not just the aspect of the creation of this, this knowledge assets and then the transfer of it as well as the execution, right? But basically the data, if we can understand, when an expert, records their steps that need to be done on a particular process and a technician is executing on it, right? To see what really happens, where do they get stuck? Where would they need more help, right? So that data, that trends and those insights are very important. And we place a lot of premium on that as well to capture that information, because that will determine whether they need to improve the instructions to make it more relevant, or maybe they need to be changed a little bit, or maybe more training is needed in certain aspects, right? And that's having the data available and having those trends available will allow companies to go from a more reactive approach to a more predictive approach. Systems can start giving them intelligent recommendations to say, if you've done this step before, just skip the next one. It's okay because you've already done this. So rather than go through the same things again, so you can start tailoring and creating intelligent recommendations that will streamline the execution of work.
That's great, Nag. And actually, what you both said, I think, points in a really interesting direction around helping to support frontline team members. So there's a great power in this idea of learning in the flow of work. What we've talked about before about, as a company, about the power of guidance, which happens when you're actually trying to do something and you're helped with it and you're guided through dealing with a particular issue, versus what Tom talked about earlier about the in-classroom training, the more kind of formal training, and how those play out in terms of an employee life cycle. So what we're showing here is the IDC's employee life cycle framework. And Tom, perhaps you can talk a bit about how you see this kind of approach being married with an overall life cycle framework for employees.
Yeah, I think it's super important, right? One thing that we've talked a lot about the last 10, 15 years is that employees are going to have to continually learn, continue to be retrained in new processes and new technologies, et cetera. And so it's one of the most exciting things about this technology is to be able to help drive. I love that phrase, guidance versus training, right? Helping people who are maybe 80% of the way there, who are doing some aspect of the process, but they need guidance the rest of the way. But it really does, not only does it drive productivity and benefits to the enterprise, but it drives happy employees. People want to continue to learn. They want to continue to be valuable. They want to know that they're not static, that they are continuing to evolve during their tenure with a company. And I think organizations are becoming increasingly aware that is not nice to have. That is absolutely something they have to have. And utilizing technology to drive that, I think, is becoming more and more important to organizations, and HR is beginning to play a bigger role in that.
Yeah, and I know as a company, we've also had some of our customers looking at how to take this approach and apply the technology to meet the challenge. And Nag, did you want to talk a little bit about, I know we had one particular customer in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because in some ways I come from the world of learning and talent development. So this completely resonates. What Tom said completely resonates with me, is that there is always the notion of guidance versus training. You can only train someone so much. Sometimes you need to give the support or the performance support at the point of need, right? And I think that becomes a key aspect. But we did work with a company which was basically one of the leaders in kind of the mining space. But they actually took a very interesting approach. I would call it a more talent-led approach, where the focus was on employee engagement and development, right? So they were trying to use augmented reality to not only basically help with job aids and work procedures, right? But they wanted to kind of have a single source for it. So meaning a single place to author training material, but also to author the work procedures. So that they could essentially render the same thing in different formats. So if it's, you could sit in front of a computer and look at the, the course, and then put on a, pair of glasses, and then see that, execute that in a step-by-step way, and go through that as you're in front of work, right? So basically a single source kind of an authoring, but at the same time to bring that data together, right? To say, okay, the individual took this training, then they actually performed this work, and so it all contributed towards a kind of a unified view of the employee's development plan. And then the other thing that was interesting was, and I noted in the slide here, there's an aspect of assessment. They were looking to use augmented reality for also assessment. So, if you're working in front of a machinery that's either dangerous or expensive, and you should be qualified to work on that, right? So basically you need to prove to somebody that you can do the work. So usually the evaluation of that tends to be in person, or somebody says, show me how to do a particular thing. And when they feel comfortable, then they're certified to work on that, and you acquire a certain skill level. So they were trying to use augmented reality to also get to the same result. So I thought that was very interesting. And so I think the development of the employees and helping them guide versus a pure training is critical.
Thanks for that insight, Nag. With that, I'd like to thank both of you for the time today as we wrap up. We'll now switch to taking some of your questions. We've received a number of questions over the last 45 minutes or so, and we'll give you just a couple of additional minutes to send any additional questions to us using the questions pane on the control panel. While you're sending in those questions, we'll briefly reflect on a few things we've covered so far. That the world of work has changed, with the work of frontline teams having changed even more, and that these changes require attention to completely new requirements, such as work distancing and social distancing. That frontline teams, when they've been supported by technology in the past, have been offered point solutions which, by definition, can't meet a broad need. And that as digitization of work has moved from the front office to the front line, industrial enterprises are increasingly demanding that their frontline teams be empowered with the same kinds of integrated platforms that have been so successful for them in an office setting. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions. So thank you, everybody, for all of the great questions that are coming in. I'm going to start off with a question to both Tom and to Nag. Maybe starting with you, Tom. As you talk with enterprises and their frontline teams, what's the biggest challenge you see them facing right now? I think you're unmuted now.
Thanks. So the question was, what is some of the biggest challenges that enterprises are facing today?
Correct.
Well, I think, one of the biggest issues right now is there is a lot of uncertainty about when people will return to some semblance of, normal in terms of the workplace. This is particularly challenging in industry verticals like manufacturing. And so I think one of the big challenges that big companies are facing right now is how do you allocate tight IT budgets to support initiatives like bringing augmented reality into the workplace to help not only address these near-term issues, but the longer-term challenges that these organizations are facing. So it's definitely a bit of a juggling act right now, right? Figuring out how to spend where to spend. And then I think probably just as challenging is the fact that in a lot of instances, the IT staff is also working from home, or they're spread out. And so that adds another level of complexity when you think about bringing in either new technologies or moving faster on technologies that you've begun to embrace already.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely see that. Nag, do you want to jump in and just kind of offer a bit of perspective on what we're seeing from our customers?
Sure. Kind of picking up on what Tom said, I think there's obviously a huge demand these days in finding ways to fast track the adoption of such technologies, right? And so companies are looking to find hacks in some way because the times when you could do an extended proof of concept or a trial may not be there. The luxury may not be there, right? So you need to be able to kind of hone in on what you would like. So companies are asking themselves the tough question, saying, what exactly do we need to start with? Let's not try to boil the ocean. Let's try to figure out which particular aspects of those technologies can benefit our teams the most to start with, and then we can tack on additional capabilities. So a lot of the fast tracking, a lot of quicker decisions, a lot of clarity around what they need to start with is what we're seeing out there.
Thanks for that, Nag. One of the other things that we see, and I think is always interesting to talk about, is the advice for enterprises trying to decide which hardware is going to meet their needs as they work to better support their frontline teams. And Tom, this is obviously kind of the bread and butter for you every day as you look at that aspect of the market. How do you advise companies that come to you and ask that question?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think what we've seen happen, particularly since the pandemic took hold, is a lot of organizations are taking a beat and thinking about, can we drive, for example, an augmented reality experience through devices that we already own. So if the company is distributing tablets, for example, or smartphones to some subset of the workforce, can we start there and then think about when and where an expensive investment in a headset makes sense? And one of the things that I think has become increasingly clear to me as we watch this market evolve is that there is always going to be a subset of users, maybe managers, for example, for which the tablet and the smartphone are good enough because of the way they're going to use the technology, and moving to a headset really you can focus that on the employees that need to work hands-free, that need to be able to manipulate real-world objects using both hands, and so I think that's one of the things that was becoming clear even as we headed into 2020, and then became, I think, more crystal clear as organizations who were maybe at the very early stages of looking at headsets said, okay, what can we do with the phones and tablets that our employees are already carrying?
Right, it became a much more kind of device agnostic or device appropriate kind of market. Nag, what are your observations on this?
I think Tom covered pretty much all of those items. I think that's exactly how customers are looking at these technologies these days. What's already out there, and what can we do in the near term, and maybe some of them maybe a bit down the road, right? So, in some ways, the cop-out answer is there's no one size fits all, right? As we discussed earlier in the webinar portion, basically it starts with and ends with the use case to some degree. What we try to do is to help customers kind of take a really good look at what they are trying to accomplish and their timelines, and then giving them options based on that around form factors, around the size of the devices, the battery power, the handheld versus the hands-free needs, any weight, noise of the environment, right? The level of comfort with the users, change management being a consideration, as well as their existing infrastructure and the ways they can distribute the applications, right? So all of that is a consideration to what hardware and what options customers end up deciding. But a lot of it resides with the use case.
Yeah, well, so let's talk a bit about use cases. And you know, we have questions about, well, what's a good example of a use case that's going to guide you in one direction or another? And Tom, you were talking a bit about that. So is there a kind of a matrix? Is there a process for making that decision?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to, like Nog said, you know, one size doesn't fit all, and that sounds like a cop-out, but you know, sort of intrinsic in that question is the person who is seeking, for example, remote assistance, are they able to do the job that they are standing in front of a machine to do with one hand if they're holding a phone in the other hand? I think one of the other areas, you know, where a headset really does become important is on the knowledge capture side of things. But each individual job, I think, is going to ultimately dictate, you know, which direction you need to go, or more specifically, what problem you're trying to solve. And I think the other thing to consider is when you're thinking about that problem to solve or that job to be done, you know, are you talking about doing it in a dangerous situation? So, for example, if the problem you're trying to solve has a person on a pole, you know, working near power lines, probably not ideal to have one hand holding a device. So I think there are some sort of simple if-then statements that you can drive. But for a lot of organizations, even if ultimately, you know, a headset proves to be the right choice, there are probably still jobs inside that organization where you can test it out on a mobile device first.
Right. And we're getting more questions in. So I've got a question now about, we've referred to the difference between guidance versus training. And Tom, I know you spoke to that a bit. Do you want to say a bit more about how you see the difference between guidance versus training?
Yeah, it's a really interesting distinction. So training, the way I see it, is when you are in the act of trying to move knowledge from either an existing employee or knowledge base inside the organization to a new employee or an employee who's being trained up, right? So moving from one job to another. And in that case, you know, you're showing them how to do the job, ideally by allowing them to walk through the job, maybe potentially be, you know, in the same physical space to do it. Whereas guidance is, to me, you know, a person is on the job, they've completed the job to the best of their ability, but the job itself is not done, and I need to reach out for help. So, for example, you know, I'm standing in front of a box and it's configured in a way that I've not seen before. So you dial up through remote assistance an expert back at HQ who can walk you through finishing the job, so guiding you through unfamiliar territory. So that's the way I would think about it. You know, very similar in some ways, but I think potentially two ends, you know, beginning and the final part of a educational process.
Great. Yeah, and Nog, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think that was you know, that was pretty much covered, at least the viewpoint on where guidance comes into picture. You know, I think as mentioned earlier, a lot of times what a person needs while they're performing work is access to the right contextual information, essentially what is needed at that moment of need, right? And usually that could be maybe a simple picture, maybe a simple screenshot with an annotation, right? Maybe just a schematic for that particular machine, right? So it's that information that quote unquote augments your thinking and your view of what you're seeing in front of you, right? So that makes a difference in creating, a more efficient way of doing things. So I think that's a very, very key aspect of guidance, and I think AR can play a huge role.
Thank you, Nag. Yeah, we have another question now about hurdles, and Dan Smith asks, I find our biggest hurdle is noise. In a manufacturing environment, there are often multiple machines running on the floor where we are attempting to help a customer. Any input or ideas on overcoming that situation? And maybe you want to start on that one, Tom.
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I mean, I think one of the things to consider when we talk about augmented reality is that there are going to be instances where you are it has to be driven by visual versus auditory, and then in some instances it could be the reverse. So I'll be perfectly honest. I don't have a great solution, either technical or from a use case perspective. I think really the only way to address that is to try to put yourself in a position to be able to communicate either via typing or annotations, for example. But I don't have a great answer for the noise problem.
Thanks for that.
I can jump in on that a little bit.
Want to offer?
Yeah, definitely. I can jump in. There are some options. Again, as Tom mentioned, may not always be the perfect ones in there. Some of the headsets do come with pretty good noise cancellation features. They take out a lot of the ambient noise, but there are different ways to interact with the system. So their engagement and interaction model support will come into play here. So if it's a noisy environment and voice commands are not an option, then many of the headset manufacturers do support tactile inputs, touchpads, trackpads, right, to be able to move up and down and kind of navigate and perform the activities you want to be able to do. In addition, we support basically a notion of gestures, right? So you can kind of gesture with your hand, and if the device can pick up the gestures and understand the depth part of it, you can perform operations to, say, move from one screen to another, to be able to swipe, right? Some of the simple actions can also be performed in a visual way, which the system can pick up, understand, and help you navigate through the various screens. So providing a complementary set of engagement models and interactions is important, precisely for the reasons that you cannot control the environment on the shop floor.
Great, thank you, Nag. I've also had a request to repeat what I said earlier about the recording of this session being available. We will be sending out mail later today after the session with details on how to access the recording. So thank you again for that question. I did have a question about regulatory constraints to allow remote validation. And maybe we could start with you, Tom, in terms of solutions that you've seen or approaches that you've seen, such as aerospace maintenance scenario like the one we were talking about earlier, where regulatory systems are working to allow for this.
I'm just going to be upfront. I don't have a good answer to this, so I'm going to punt it to Nag and see if he does.
All right, Nag.
Yes. So yes, they do. We do work with customers in the aerospace and aerospace maintenance industries. So we have some experience dealing with the various processes around compliance. There's basically a lot of constraints about what information can be shown, what information can be broadcast, what information can be recorded. So you need to ensure that you're communicating to the users at all times what's being captured, what's happening, right? And then there are aspects about what happens to that data, right? Does it needs to be kept for a certain period of time? Audit trails have to be preserved, for example, for inspection later, right? So the amount of time you can keep a data, what kind of information you can store, and what kind of information you can sometimes show when you're doing a remote validation, and what happens to those recordings if there are any. So data management is a key part of some of the compliance requirements, and again, it all depends on the industry to industry, and a little bit on the countries as well. So our role is to work with those enterprises and the regulatory bodies to ensure that the remote validation meets those regulatory approvals.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. And thanks to the panel today and to all of you for joining. I'm going to emphasize again, just so that everybody knows, that there will be a recording of the session available, and I'll send out a link to that recording to everybody who registered for the webinar, whether they showed up today or not. And I'd also like to let you know that today is the first webinar in our new AR Insights series. So we will be doing more of these. So expect to see a save the date for the next episode in this series shortly. And don't hesitate to get in contact with us if you want to learn more about how we can help frontline teams. We'd love to hear from you, and come and visit our website at athirair.com. Thank you again.